Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to Addis Dialogue. In recent years, Ethiopia has been undergoing significant economic transformations, from opening up its banking sector to foreign investors to proposing record-breaking national budget for 2025-26 fiscal year, to continued international support from institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank. And these new developments signal both opportunities and challenges as the country navigate reform, recovery, and growth. And to unpack what all this means for Ethiopia's economy and the financial sector, I'm so honored to be joined by Dr. Constantinos Berhutesfa, a senior and renowned economist with his different perspectives. I am your host, Shifara Olago. Do stay with us. Thank you so much for making the time to talk to us.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure. Thank you.
Ethiopia has been going through a number of reforms, one of which is its economic reforms and transformations, which includes the liberalization of the banking sector to foreign banks, allowing them to have subsidiaries in the country, to open new branches, and even acquire stakes in local banks. So what exactly does this mean for Ethiopia's economic aspect and the broader economy of this East African nation?
Well, I think the background to all this is the kind of seismic change that has taken place in the Ethiopian financial policy environment. I think after 50 years, we're now setting up the capital markets again. We had share markets under Emperor Haile Selassie, and then, of course, foreign banks are coming in. The Ethiopian birr has been allowed now to float in the market. And so there are so many changes that were necessary and fundamental to economic transformation. So one of this is the introduction of foreign banks into Ethiopia. There is a historical perspective to it. We had, of course, foreign banks in Ethiopia before, but the point is, under the military government of Ethiopia, the banks were not allowed to be in private hands, so the only sole banks that existed at that time was the Commercial Bank of Ethiopia, and of course we had the Development Bank of Ethiopia and the Mortgage Bank of Ethiopia, all owned by the government. And then under the EPRDF, this policy continued, but private Ethiopian banks were allowed. So, but this has a fundamental problem, of course, with the removal of the Derg's government. There has been tremendous support to the government from the IMF, from the World Bank, from bilateral support amounting to $5 billion a year. And then later on, the advent of China into the African development scene brought billions of dollars in infrastructure development. Now I think it's a good time to liberalize our finance because, for one, we have to pay our debts. Number two, the kind of loans we used to get cannot be available now for different reasons. The COVID pandemic, the kind of global instability we have, like the Ukraine war and the Middle East war. And therefore, it's incumbent to have the foreign banks come here. When the foreign banks come here, they come with a capital. That's exactly what happened with China. That's what happened with UAE. When we were starting socialism in Ethiopia in the 1970s, UAE became independent. And it started its own currency called the dirham. Now UAE is the center of finance for the Middle East and Africa. China has become a member of the World Trade Organization in 2001. Now it's the second largest economy in the world. Of course, in terms of purchasing power parity, China is the biggest economy in the world today. So there are lessons we can gain from these two countries. Of course, we can mention other countries too. By liberalizing their finance, they have brought some kind of a revolutionary development in their countries. So the entry of foreign banks into Ethiopia will bring in necessary capital for development. That's number one. Number two, they're going to pull in investors into Ethiopia. Investors usually don't come with dollars sticking out of their breast pockets. They come here and look for loans. And therefore, they're going to come here to invest in agriculture, industry, and mining, infrastructure, by borrowing money from these international banks. The challenge has been all Ethiopian banks combined, I don't believe have loan capital that would even build one single hydro dam. So now with these big banks that can mobilize their resources from global resources, it's going to be possible for them to be able to finance industrial growth and development and transformation. So investors would be looking for this. When I talk about investors, I'm looking also at Ethiopian investors, domestic investors. Yeah. We have huge potential in agriculture, in mining, water resources. And we have a young population. 70% of Ethiopians are young. In this young population, most of them are coming out now at our 50 universities, hundreds of vocational schools and colleges. And therefore, it's very important that there is finance to bring this young population to be part and parcel of the national development.
On the other side, how are foreign banks responding to these new directives to Ethiopia's opening itself up to them, calling them to come and invest? What's the reaction like so far?
Well, even when I was in the United Nations in New York, we've been debating with the Ethiopian government and pushing the Ethiopian government to allow foreign banks to come into Ethiopia. This has not been a secret. At the World Economic Forum, several issues have been raised to the then Prime Minister asking to open up, liberalize the finance sector and the telecom sector. In fact, one of the challenges we had to join the World Trade Organization was because these two sectors were closed. So it's not something new that's coming up. But the government now has boldly opened up the financial sector. And we'll see, because it's only a week or more than a week that this has been announced formally. This has been on the works for the last 2 years. And then, of course, the National Bank had to prepare the necessary regulatory instruments to be able to receive foreign banks. And therefore, it's going to be slow, definitely. Foreign banks are going to weigh in the advantage and potential threats to their work in Ethiopia. And therefore, it's important that the Ethiopian government continues to mobilize what you call nation branding, the way people see our nation. Yeah. Therefore, it's very important that some kind of road show also should be assembled by the National Bank of Ethiopia and other responsible bodies in the government to attract banks that have good capital and that can come in Ethiopia and be able to invest.
And how will this move affect local banks by increased competition from foreign banks? And what concrete steps need to be taken in order to make sure that they remain both competitive and also resilient?
Well, again, we'll have to look at the stories from other countries that have gone through this. For one, when I was working as a senior official in Nigeria for the United Nations, they had more than 300 private banks. And therefore, the important thing was to consolidate these banks. Eventually, they brought them down to 22, and now we see few Nigerian banks that have global reach. In fact, one of them is going to come into Ethiopia as a foreign investor. So, and if you look at China and the UAE, the first thing they did was when they allowed foreign banks to come in, number one, foreign banks cannot open branch. Number two, they cannot open saving accounts. That is the domain of the local banks here. And number three, foreign banks will be only engaged, and of course this is the easiest thing for them to do, on financing major loans, the government to private sector with big industries or agricultural enterprise. And therefore, The local banks will work in conjunction with these foreign banks, for example, in opening minor LCs, trade LCs, which the foreign banks would not want to do because they cannot control it. So there is going to be a kind of symbiotic relationship between the local banks and the foreign banks coming in. And I believe the local banks will benefit tremendously in terms of foreign currency availability, letter of credit availability from these international banks. The challenge for foreign banks is, one, they will have to consolidate in a big way. We have more than 30 banks in Ethiopia now, and some of them can't even achieve the national bank target of capital, 5 billion birr. So I'm sure the National Bank will raise the capital of local banks to something like 20 billion or 25 billion birr very soon. That will force in local banks to consolidate, which means they will be in a much stronger position. If you see the experience of UAE, that's exactly what happened. We have 14 out of the 23 largest banks in the world are found in the UAE free zones. In China only allowed its local banks to compete with foreign banks equally only 3 years ago. And therefore, now Chinese banks are huge banks. The local banks themselves have become now international. So our banking sector will be developing very fast if there is a kind of consolidation. And of course, they will benefit from new management responsibilities, the technological development, and of course, availability of foreign capital. The other thing is, take for example, the Commercial Bank of Ethiopia. If it was allowed to continue the way it was during Emperor Haile Selassie, Commercial Bank of Ethiopia would have been one of the biggest banks in Africa, given the fact that at that time we had a share market, which basically it was the government that was owning much of the share market. But if you talk about foreign direct investment, the highest foreign direct investment that came to Ethiopia during Emperor Haile Selassie. Most of the factories that we have in Ethiopia today were built under Emperor Haile Selassie. Of course, the Derg nationalized them, and they were privatized and stuff like that. They were small in size, but for the time, that 50 years ago, they were pretty much advanced. And therefore, now, the Commercial Bank of Ethiopia could have been at its best today as an international bank. Take, for example, Ethiopian Airlines. Ethiopian Airlines was built on a share market. It used to be a share company in its name for a long period of time. I don't know if they have canceled it now. Of course, the shareholders, again, were Commercial Bank of Ethiopia and government entities. But the point is, the idea of a capitalist development was seeded in at the time very seriously. So our banks now need to work together on how they could merge to become more bigger banks that provide more proficient services. This challenge is minimized by the fact that now we have more digital banking. They don't even need to open branches anymore. Sweden, South Korea are shutting down all their branch banking. The world is moving into a cashless society. So for our banks, it's not a question of how much human power and branches they have, but it's how much qualified, technically, staff that they can garner. But I see a bright future for our local banks.
Wow. Thank you so much for that insightful perspective. Let's also talk about the budget, this year's budget that has recently been unveiled, a record-breaking 1.93 trillion birr budget for the 2025-26 fiscal year. As an economist, what do you make out of this?
You know, under the principles of public finance, under the public administration and policy at Addis Ababa University is something that we've been providing courses, and I've been teaching public administration and public policy. And the important issue is in public finance management, budgeting becomes a key source of our fiscal policy. So when you say fiscal policy, a budget is an instrument which the government uses to accomplish its yearly activities. Some of them are what you call midterm budgeting, which like projects like building dams and roads might take more than a year, more than 2-3 years. And therefore, the budgets that we have now within the government is something that's been compiled by different regions, by different oredas, by different zones. And of course, this is assembled by the Ministry of Finance and finally presented to our lawmakers. So the legislature, by approving the 1.9 trillion budget, what I see now is a slight shift from a major part of the budget used to be for capital development. Now much of it is going for recurrent activities and services. And I think this is quite reasonable given the fact that we've passed through a tumultuous 5-year period in COVID-19, then we have the Ukraine war, and of course we have our challenge inside the country itself. And therefore, now it's time to shelve off some capital projects, new ones, and focus on sustaining and maintaining what has been done so far. So that's one of the focus I see. I see a 14 billion budget allocation now for sustainable development goals. This is very important. I recently presented a paper on the evaluation of sustainable development goals to the UN General Assembly in New York last September. And the world is not ready to meet the sustainable development goals, which are going to be completed by 2030. But in Ethiopia, I think the effort should continue to finance the sustainable development goals, so at least we can preferably meet some of the most acute sustainable development goals, like poverty elimination, absolute poverty elimination, things like gender equality, things like the ability of our environment to sustain us on climate change. These are pertinent issues that our government should select and try to drive, because I don't think we can reach all 17 goals by even 2030. Whatever miracle comes in, the world is very, very lagging on this. And the fact now is that major donors like the United States are stopping their aid to developing nations. And it's not only the United States, Europe is doing the same thing. Their internal demands are becoming very much bigger. Europe is entangled with the Eurasian war in Ukraine, where they have to provide Ukraine with weapons and everything, so they're going to slash funds from development aid. And there is also this crisis of populism. Populist political parties are rising and asking and demanding different kinds of questions which look more into their own country rather than their global view and supporting global governance institutions. So definitely this budget is going to help us to do this. One thing of concern that I have is during the hearings of the House of Representatives by our Auditor General, there have been a lot of abuse of the government funds. This is something the government must take into account, that this budget must not be liable to another kind of corruption and misrepresentation, and therefore I heard the Auditor General saying billions have been lost because of corruption or because of mismanagement. And therefore, it's very important that we implement this budget properly. And with the level of GDP growth that Ethiopia is showing, there could be a potential to defeat the ills of development, inflation, stagflation, and related issues that come with growth and development.
Let's also talk about Ethiopia's, the support that Ethiopia is gaining from international institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and others, of course. So in this regard, how is the international financial institution supporting Ethiopia, and what's the prospect like in the future?
Well, you see, the IMF and the World Bank, what they are called collectively Bretton Woods institutions because they were set up in Bretton Woods in 1944. The World Bank was supposed to drive global development after the Second World War, and the IMF was set up to stabilize the international financial system. At that time, we didn't have a global currency per se, where countries can exchange. Of course, at that time, the UK was ruling half the world, so the British pound was the main currency. But at the setting up of the IMF, what was agreed was a country which has a huge gold reserve in its national coffers should be representing the world currency. That's why the dollar came to be the world currency. The IMF has its own currency called the SDR. So its main purpose, the IMF's main purpose is to look into countries' prudent economic performance, number one, and number two, to provide resources that are not available to developing nations so that these developing nations could fill in the gaps that they have in their development challenge through the funds they receive through the IMF. So the IMF, in our case, has an important other mission. If you remember during COVID, when supply chains globally broke down completely, what really happened was most of the developing nations were left with their debts without bringing in any form of development. So the G20 decided to put $5 trillion to lift up the developing nations from their debts that had accrued because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So to access this, what you call DSSI, the debt service suspension initiative, we had to have the IMF clearance. And therefore, it was necessary to negotiate with the IMF to be able to get their agreement on the way forward with Ethiopia. And of course, the IMF had to present conditions. These conditions were the reform in the financial system in Ethiopia. These conditions were the reform in the governance of our finance and our development initiatives. That has been achieved. The Article 4 consultations that have been undertaken between the IMF and the Ethiopian government have been achieved. The IMF is releasing funds to the Ethiopian government now. And of course, now we have started negotiating with our debtors for the debt suspension initiatives. So I see this as an important locus of development within our government's behavior in terms of international financial institutions, because unless we talk to these institutions, then these institutions will just ignore us. And the fact is, you will come into default. Once you have defaulted, it's not only that you don't get additional loans, but the investors wouldn't be even coming to this country. So the future that I see is prudent management of our economy, which is now being supervised by the IMF and to some extent by the World Bank. The African Development Bank also is a stakeholder. The African Exim Bank is a stakeholder. All these banks will be looking at the prudent implementation of our national economy in general, which means we need to look into corruption, illicit financial flows, illicit trade. These are issues that we can stop. And I think we should call upon the government to work with civil society and the investigative media to be able to look into these ills that are really eroding the economy.
Thank you so much for making the time and for being my guest on such a short notice. I really, really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure. It's always a pleasure. Thank you.
That brings us to the end of today's discussions on Ethiopia's economic transformations, the challenges, the opportunities, and the way forward. A big thank you to my guest today, and of course, many thanks to you as well for having been with us so far. Until I see you next time with yet another program, it's a goodbye from me. Shukran.